What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to my channel. In this video I will be going over what is AWS Lambda. I also have a blog post about AWS Lambda and why it's so great and why it's so amazing for serverless architecture. I'll leave a link in the description. Pretty much it goes over some terminology for AWS Lambda, why it's so great, what are some cons, what are some pros, what are some use cases. So if you want to read more about that, I'll leave a link in the description for that. I recently also made a video about what is AWS S3 and why it's AWS most popular service. The cool thing about it is I also created a video utilizing S3 and Lambda. So once you get an understanding of S3 and Lambda, you now have a project to work on. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. Let's get started. So seriously, what is AWS Lambda? And you can see that the logo is on the left, it's a Lambda. But AWS Lambda is a service that lets you run code without provisioning or managing servers. So you can run code virtually using any language supported. So that includes Java, Go, PowerShell, Node, JavaScript, C#, Python. So most of the most popular languages, right? And this is why AWS Lambda has become so popular for serverless architecture, right? And a video is coming out on that, on what is serverless architecture and why it's why it's used so extensively nowadays, especially with cloud providers like AWS and Azure and stuff like that. But it's important because now we don't have to worry about provisioning our own servers. We can just host it on the cloud provider, and all we got to do is worry about coding. All right, we don't have to worry about infrastructure. All we got to do is write the code in the language that we prefer and that Lambda supports. And once it's done, all we got to do is invoke it, and it's invoked from within AWS servers. So that makes our life so much easier. So that is what AWS Lambda is. It allows us to run our code virtually while AWS handles all of the infrastructure. Now, I'm saying so many good things about Lambda, but what are some use cases, right? So I wrote down a couple of use cases. I try to fill up the screen as much as I can. But these are pretty great use cases for Lambda, and there's many more that you can do with Lambda, but these are the ones that I feel like, really shows how extensive Lambda is. So the first thing is, like I said, it's great for serverless architecture, right? It's a way to build and run applications without having to manage infrastructure. I wrote about this in my blog. I'll leave a link in the description if you guys just want to read up on what is serverless architecture. A video is coming soon, and subscribe for that. But all you have to do is worry about coding and connecting to whatever other service that we want to connect our Lambda functions to. So if you want to connect it to a AWS RDS, which is the relational database for AWS, right? We can do that. If you want to connect it to DynamoDB, we can do that. So we can create these functions in the cloud, and we can either call them manually or we can set them up to listen for certain events. Then there's logging and analytics, right? So Lambda can be used to process logs and analytics. If you have a certain message that's being processed through the logs and you want to run a function based on that, you can do that. Or if there's a percentage that is off in the analytics, you can send a notification using a Lambda function, or do a certain task using a Lambda function. So you can process logs and analytics. You can process S3 buckets. I already have a video on this, like showing an example of processing S3 objects as they come in, right? So we can use Lambda functions to create a trigger based on certain S3 events. So in the video that I created, we created a trigger, and that trigger will happen when we upload a file to S3, specifically a CSV file. And once you do, right, the Lambda function will see that event, and it will process that CSV file. So it doesn't necessarily have to only be uploads. It can be listening for any event, updates, any of that. So I'll leave a link in the description for that video as well, where I put it somewhere on the screen. But to me, that's a great introduction to Lambda functions and S3. So then there's use case number 4, which is sending notifications. We can send notifications from our apps, right? So say for instance, a user just signed up or they logged in for the first time. We can use Lambda to connect AWS SNS to send notifications saying welcome to our application. Send an email, notification, and say welcome to our application. The fifth one is a cron job. So we don't necessarily have to it doesn't necessarily have to be an event. It can be incrementally. So say for instance you want a function to run every day at 9 a.m. right? Every day at 9 a.m. we want to scan our database, our RDS database, or our DynamoDB database, right? we want to check everybody's birthday and see if it matches today's birthday, right? And if it does, then send out a custom email based on that individual's birthday. We can do that. So you can use cron jobs as well to run incrementally. It doesn't have to be a certain event like upload. It can be time based, right? And then another use case, and the last use case that I've thought would be a great example of why AWS Lambda is so amazing is pull events. So say for instance, nowadays everything is very real time based, right? Data is coming in and we have to process them fast because everything is moving. It's real time, right? So we can poll streams, right? So say for instance you have experience with things like Kafka and RabbitMQ, right? We can poll streams of data, and based on as the data comes in, you can think of it like a pipe, right? You know how water goes through a pipe, but in this case water is data. So as the data is going through this pipe, there's a lot of data coming in, a lot of real-time data. We just making sure that we check every single piece of data within that pipe, and if we get a data that we're interested in, we can invoke a function based on that. So maybe there's a scenario that you're looking out for. Maybe somebody passed the threshold of money, right? We want to make sure that we invoke a log or invoke a message to be sent to a higher up saying, okay, this person just spent $1 million. We should probably look into that. So you can do that. So pull events, connecting to different services like Kafka, RabbitMQ, and sending or triggering Lambda functions based on that. So there's so many cool things you can do with Lambda, and all you gotta do is worry about coding it. And just a little brief overview on some more features that Lambda has to offer. Connecting with other services. So I talked about S3 and SNS already, but Lambda can connect with many other AWS services. It can connect with Kinesis, IoT, Cognito, SQS. So that's another thing that Lambda is great at, is connecting with other AWS services, right? You can orchestrate multiple functions, right? So we're not restricted to just running one function at a time. We can orchestrate many functions to work in conjunction, right? So we can even create flows using AWS step functions to create state machines. So we can manage functions to do certain things based on certain steps, right? Or certain criterias. Then there's custom backends. We can leverage API Gateway and Lambda to create custom backends in many languages that it supports. So all we got to do is route a request, and once a request is hitting a certain endpoint in API Gateway, right, we can run a specific Lambda function, and voila, there's some magic, right? There's a custom backend, because all it's expecting is you run the function, you return a response, and we're good to go. Then there's flexible resources. We can allocate more memory and CPU power to our Lambda function based on the needs, right? So if you know that it's going to be used pretty intensively, or that the code that you're writing is pretty data intensive, you can increase the memory and the CPU power. Then there's the automatic scaling, which is very useful. Based on the sheer amount of requests Lambda receives, it can scale up, and it can even scale down if the request decreases. And the only issue is that it's limited to 1,000 functions running concurrently. So you have to think about that. Now, with every great thing, there's usually a con, right? And I would say one con is that, the cold starts. The cold starts can be an issue. Lambda can experience cold starts. It's like going to the gym and going straight to the heavy weights. Sometimes you gotta, stretch, right? If you don't stretch, you might hurt yourself. So when a Lambda instance handle a first request for the first, like say for instance, it's the first request of the day, the response times can increase. And that's why it's called the cold start, right? But there is a solution that AWS has come up with for this problem, which is called provision concurrency. So provision concurrency is, it initializes a request number of, based on the environment, so that it will prepare a response immediately when the function is invoked. So when Lambda allocates an instance for your function, the runtime for your code, and the initialization of the things that your code requires, is defined outside of the handler for your for your AWS Lambda function. So if your code and the dependencies are pretty big, it can take a long time for it to get everything that it needs to run your code. So that's why a cold start can occur. But with provision concurrency, right, it's going to make sure that it already gets all that it needs to run your code at all times. So it makes sure that all requests are served in a proper response time, a low response time, low latency. So You would have to configure this, you know, when you're creating your Lambda function, and it is going to come at an extra charge. But if it's something that you want to make sure that you don't, you don't have, like you want to make sure that you don't have cold starts, this is a solution to that. So just to show that I'm not lying, I just want to show you some companies that actually uses AWS Lambda. Netflix. I'm pretty sure everybody know what Netflix is. The streaming company for movies and shows. You got Udemy. I'm pretty sure some of you guys probably learned some code from Udemy, or business stuff, or any hobby stuff that you have through Udemy. They use Lambda. Figma, Vogue. So there's a lot of these big companies that leverages Lambda functions, or all other services that AWS has to offer. But I just wanted to show you guys that don't be afraid to use AWS Lambda. It can be useful, especially for whatever application that you're using it for, because other big companies are using it as well. I'm not saying you have to copy them, but I'm just saying that it is proven to be useful in big corporations, right? So now it's time to give a little tour on AWS Lambda. We'll just see, how it looks like and how we can create our own. All right, so quickly logging into your console, you should see something similar to this. Maybe you don't have any costs and some charges on your account yet. Hopefully not, but go to the search bar and put Lambda, and that should bring you to a page like this, or something similar to this, right? If you don't have a function, I already have a function created. I created this for the trigger that I created for my video. Link in the description. But if you don't have a function, then it should be like a pretty nice page, and it should say create function somewhere. But there's also a create function button here, which we're going to use and click. So there are some settings. So the first one is, it gives you the ability to be the author from scratch. So we can create it ourselves, or we can use a blueprint, or we can use a container image. So you can play around with this if you have a container that you want to use. If you want to go based on some sample code and configurations, presets, you could do this. Or if you want to just create it yourself, you're the author, you're the painter, you could do this. So then we just have to define a function name for the function that you want to use. There's some rules to that. So you can only use letters, numbers, hyphens, or underscores with no spaces. Then there is the runtime. Like I said, you can use languages that AWS supports for your Lambda function. So by default, it is Node. But if you open up the drop down, you should see things like Net or .NET, Go, Java, Python, Ruby, and then some other versions that they support. So you can go through that, select whatever you want for that, and go from there. And the version, if you want a lower version, then you can do that too. But these are some other things that they support in Lambda functions, or the other languages that they support. You could choose the architecture, so x86, or you could use ARM64. And then there's the permission section. So if you have a specific role that you want to attach to this Lambda function, then you can do that. I know for my video, I had to create a new role so that S3 will have access or Lambda will have access to my S3 bucket. So if you're going to use it with other services, you're most likely going to have to create a role so that your Lambda function can communicate with your other services. So, and then there's the advanced settings. So if you want to enable code signing, function URL, enable function URL, you can use it for, assigning HTTP endpoints to your Lambda function. Enable tags. So if you want to give your Lambda function a tag, you can do that. It's essentially like a label. And if you want to enable VPCs, a virtual private connection with your Lambda function, you can do that as well. Or connected to a VPC, you can do that as well. So, and then once all of that is done, you just press create function, which I won't do because I already have a function that I created. But once you do, it should look like this. It should be, the function name that you defined, the runtime that you selected. Maybe it'll show like the last time you modified it, and stuff like that. But that'll be here. And let me just click on this function so we can see what's inside of it. So you can already see that, this is the name of the function that we created, or that I created. But if, you're using yours, then it'll be the function that you created. Then there's the trigger. So I already have a trigger assigned to this function, which is the SD trigger. So whenever, if I click on that, you'll see some information about it and even permissions and stuff like that. But yeah, it'd be the triggers that you assign to it, the details about it. So like whenever you put an object, or whenever I put an object into the bucket, then it will trigger this function. Then there's, if you want to add a trigger, then you can click on this. But then there's these tabs. There's the code, which is, this is just going to be the code that, executes when you invoke the function. So in this function, it's just a simple code to make a call to the S3 bucket, retrieve the bucket based on the event, because we receive, or in the video I go over, link in the description, but it retrieves or listens for events, and based on the events, the event is going to have the name of the bucket and the key of the file that was inserted into the bucket. So what I'm going to end up doing is using that to retrieve the item from the bucket and then processing that CSV file. So then there's a section if you want to create a test. There's monitoring. So monitoring is what I use to show when our function is invoked, or things that it's done, the logs that it's being shown, metrics. You can see that as well. How long it takes for it to invoke, or how many invocations occurred, how long it took, the success rates. Then there's the configuration, which we just saw, but you can look into other stuff like the function URL, tags, VPC, concurrency options, file system, state machines. Like I said, when it comes to creating concurrent functions. Then there's aliases. If you want to create an alias, you could. And there's a version. If you want to publish a new version of this, you could do that as well. So many things you can do with it. But like I said, I have a video that goes a little bit more in depth, how to create a trigger, how to create this, how to create a role for your Lambda function. But I just wanted to show you the ecosystem on where and how to create a function, and what are some of the settings that you can do, or provide for your Lambda function. So this is what a Lambda function is. This is how you can create one, or this is where you can create one. And I would say, if you want something that's quick and easy, you don't want to have to create your own infrastructure to utilize, then Lambda functions are your way to go. And like I said, you can play around with API gateways and configuring it with your Lambda function to create a whole serverless backend, right? So just think of use cases, think of what you need, think about how much time you need, and yeah, you can go from there. I know for my job, it kind of requires me to know a bit about all this stuff, just to make sure that if a client comes to me and say, what do you recommend, I can say, okay, if this is the use cases that you want, it's a quick development. You want to make sure that you don't have to create infrastructure yourself. You want to make sure that everything is using only one cloud provider. You don't want to have to use Azure. You don't want to have to use cloud or GCP or Google Cloud platform. Just want AWS. Okay, cool. Then we'll just create a AWS RDS service or database. Use the functions to place things into the database, and then we'll route your requests using API gateway. So think of how you can configure different things, different services, and how they can work together, and then actually do it. So the best way to learn is actually doing. So hopefully I instill some ideas into your brain. And if you have any recommendations, or if you want me to build anything with you guys or for you guys, you can leave it in the comment section below. And I hope you enjoyed it. You can leave a like, subscribe, and I'll be doing this for most of the AWS services. Usually I already write up articles about it before I even make a video. So if you guys are interested in that, I already created one for IAM, which handles policies. I already created one for EC2. I'm actually in the process of writing one for RDS. So if you want more of that before the video actually comes out, if you want to read about it, go to thinkmoretech.com. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that.